Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the Grayzone. We didn't go live on Friday, so we're here with you. This is a makeup stream on Sunday. We're glad everyone could be with us. Too much to cover in the past week to actually wrap it all up in the short time that we have, and we have a lot to look forward to with NATO coming up on the 11th in Vilnius. We're live on Rockfin as well and on Twitter. And I'm here with award-winning Canadian journalist Aaron Mate. Aaron, how's it going? Welcome back to New York.
Thank you. It's good to be back. And yeah, we're sorry, everybody. We missed you on Friday, but hopefully you can forgive us. And glad that you're with us here on Sunday in this Sunday stream. And yeah, we're not going to have the time to get to everything we want to talk about, but luckily we'll be back again. Well, I shouldn't promise. I shouldn't promise when we'll be back. We'll be back at some point.
Yeah. So
we do try. We do try, everybody. We mean to do them on Friday, but it just sometimes things get in the way.
We definitely put in an effort, and no one can say we don't. And what did Woody Allen say? 95% of success is showing up.
That's right.
Unless you're on like Epstein's plane with Noam Chomsky, that probably isn't the place to show up. I'm sure Chomsky regrets that. Anyway, the big news of the week was that the U.S. is announcing cluster munitions or DPICMs transfers to Ukraine as part of a $800 million new aid package. This follows a $500 million aid package that took place, that was sent, I believe, 2 weeks ago. And prior to that, a $325 million aid package. And it's hard to keep track of these, but obviously cluster munitions is the most significant aid package for so many reasons. And Aaron, maybe you want to, we'll elucidate some of those reasons. But the first time I saw any serious discussion of cluster munitions was when it was put forward in a June 30th hearing by this character who really just screams deep state. Like, if you don't believe in a deep state, then you don't believe in Laura Cooper, who is the assistant secretary. I think she is the deputy Pentagon secretary focused on Ukraine. And she's been in the Pentagon for over 20 years. You've never heard of her. You would never notice her walking down the street, but she's obviously playing an important role testifying here before some of the pro-war Republican elements in Congress. This is Tom Keene. And I think this is how the ball got rolling.
I would appreciate that. Thank you. Ms. Cooper, the Russian military has been using cluster munitions with impunity in Ukraine. Yet the administration has refused to provide similar weapons, known as DPICMs, to Ukraine. I'm aware of the dangers of unexploded ordnances. However, the Ukrainians believe that their battlefield benefits outweigh the costs. And since these would be used on Ukraine's own territory, Kyiv would be incentivized to judicially limit the post-war threat to civilians. Do you think that the DPICMs would be helpful to Ukraine's counteroffensive, particularly in offsetting Russia's quantitative advantage in manpower, armor, and artillery?
Mr. Chairman, our military analysts have confirmed that DPICMs would be useful, especially against dug-in Russian positions on the battlefield. The reason why you have not seen a move forward in providing this capability relates both to the existing congressional restrictions on the provision of DPICMs and concerns about allied unity. But from a battlefield effectiveness perspective, we do believe it would be useful.
So that's Laura Cooper on June 30th. And Aaron, I don't know if she figures in your book, upcoming book on Russiagate and Ukraine, but she was an impeachment figure who testified that it was essentially illegal for Donald Trump to put a freeze on $400 million of Ukraine aid back in 2019, aid that seemed to violate the spirit of the Minsk Accords. But it's not illegal to send cluster munitions to Ukraine that have been banned by almost every country in the world. Even Canada has opposed sending Ukraine so-called DPICMs. And by the way, I love how they have these little acronyms and abbreviations for every weapon to make them seem like cute little Lego creatures, ATACMs and DPICMs and HIMARS and javelins. They've got these nice little names. Jake Sullivan, the White House National Security Council director, appeared before the Beltway press corps to officially announce the delivery of DPICMs, or internationally banned cluster munitions, on July 7th, about a week after Cooper's testimony, where she basically put forward the Pentagon's line. And here's what Jake Sullivan had to say, and then we'll get your response, Aaron.
March, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, she described those munitions as, quote, exceptionally lethal weaponry, which has no place on the battlefield. So how do you square those comments with this decision?
Sorry, we came in a little late. That's he's quoting Jen Psaki, the former White House press secretary, attacking Russia for using cluster munitions.
And secondly, has Ukraine provided you with any assurances or guarantees in terms of their use in civilian areas, that they won't use them within a certain radius of civilian areas, for example?
So Ukraine has provided written assurances that it is going to use these in a very careful way that is aimed at minimizing any risk to civilians. And by the way, Ukraine, the democratically elected government,
right, written assurances. They promised us, just like they promised us about not lying about Russia attacking Poland, about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, about Snake Island,
about not using U.S. weapons to strike inside Russia. And then you had that cross-border incursion recently by Russian neo-Nazis that were allied with Ukraine, using U.S. Vehicles and weaponry to go attack inside of Russia. Yeah, so these written assurances mean absolutely nothing, and they want us to pretend as if they do.
Well, let's hear now more from Jake Sullivan on the democratically elected government of Ukraine.
Of Ukraine has every incentive to minimize risk to civilians because it's their citizens, it's Ukrainians who they are trying to protect and defend.
Wait a minute. It's their citizens, so this couldn't possibly do any harm to Ukrainians because they have a friendly fireproof DPICMs. That's kind of what he's saying.
Yeah, and then also, is he saying then that when Ukraine was using U.S. weapons to shell Ukrainians in the last 8 years who were living in the Donbass because they didn't want to live under a coup regime that wanted to wipe out, the ethnic Russian component of Ukraine, basically, is he saying that they weren't Ukrainian citizens? Those Ukrainians, that's what he's basically saying, because that's who. I mean, yes, I'm sure these clusters, munitions, some of them will target Russian troops. But given Ukraine's record inside its own country, it's quite reasonable to expect that they will also be used to target Ukrainians, just the wrong Ukrainians, the ones who don't want to live under the post-2014 coup regime, who've been rising up ever since. And it makes sense for him to erase them because that's what U.S. policy is predicated on, is forgetting that they exist and pretending as if Ukraine is a monolith and is firmly just in the U.S. NATO camp.
Yeah, I don't even know if he understands what he's saying there, but by Jake Sullivan's logic, everyone in Donetsk and Lugansk, at least, and maybe the Crimeans as well, should be Ukrainian, should live under the Ukrainian nationalist government that has attacked their language, their religion, and their Russian heritage for years, and that they simultaneously will not be attacked or harmed by cluster munitions just because, in his view, they're Ukrainians. But what has been happening since 2014 to the people of the Donbass? I mean, we've seen them hammered with Ukrainian artillery, hammered with HIMARS missiles, and even pedal mines, internationally banned pedal mines. So I think we can expect to see cluster munitions killing people who Jake Sullivan considers Ukrainian. And that's not also, that also leaves out the fact that wherever cluster munitions are deployed, they have a dud rate. And the U.S. is claiming that the DPICMs that they have a 2% dud rate. Okay, let's just accept that. That means there's going to be thousands, there will still be thousands of de facto mines scattered across Ukraine. What did it do in Vietnam? It wasn't good for civilians. Let's hear more of Scullivan.
This is not Ukraine taking these and going and using them in the Middle East or in Southeast Asia or in some faraway land. They're using them on their territory to defend their territory. So we believe that they're highly motivated to do this. And beyond being highly motivated, they have, to directly answer your question, provided these assurances to us. In terms of the ambassador's comments and other comments that have been bandied about, let me just say that the use of cluster munitions by Russia in this conflict is completely unacceptable on multiple counts. First, they are using them to attack a sovereign country in flagrant violation of international law. Second, they are using them specifically to strike after civilian targets, not only military targets, also in flagrant violation of international law. And with this weapon system, as well as other weapon systems, we have identified war crimes committed by the Russians. Third, and critically, there is a big difference between the type of cluster munition being used by Russia and the type that we would provide to Ukraine. As I mentioned before, ours have a maximum 2.5% dud rate.
Ours don't meddle. They have meddling bombs. Ours are freedom bombs.
And what he's saying here about the maximum dud rate of 2.4, whatever it is, it's not true. That's just not true. U.S. clusters have been documented to have higher dud rates. So I don't know where he's getting that from.
Well, I'd buy a used car from this guy.
Rate. The dud rate of the Russian munitions is between 30 and 40%. And just so I don't get this wrong, I will read it to you. The Department of Defense assesses that during the first year of the conflict alone, Russian-fired cluster munitions deployed from a range of weapon systems have likely expended tens of millions of submunitions or bomblets in Ukraine. And then the final point, I think this is an important point. When I talk about what Russia's doing with cluster munitions, I'm not making an argument which says, they do it, so we'll do it. The argument I'm making is that Russia has already spread tens of millions of these bomblets across Ukrainian territory. So we have to ask ourselves, is Ukraine's use of cluster munitions on that same land actually that much of an addition of civilian harm, given that that area is going to have to be demined regardless?
So that's amazing. His final point, which is the important one, he said, we're not arguing that just because Russia does it, we get to do it. But then he proceeds to make that precise argument.
Yeah, Russia's doing it. So if we do it, is it really that big of a deal? That's what he's saying. Is it really going to hurt that much more people? It's an insane argument. And it's also based on a false premise. He's saying that, well, Russia's doing it, so Ukraine has the right to do it. But the problem with making that argument is that Ukraine has been using cluster munitions, not just since Russia invaded in February 2022, but since this whole conflict began back in 2014. This is Human Rights Watch back in 2014. Ukraine, widespread use of cluster munitions, government responsible for cluster attacks on Donetsk. Did Jake Sullivan ever condemn Ukraine for using cluster munitions on Donetsk? Again, back in October 2014, this is when Human Rights Watch was saying this. Of course he didn't, because the U.S. was supporting this offensive and blocking peace efforts to end that war. And that's a big reason why we have this invasion by Russia that's still going on today. So what he's saying there is based on a false premise, because the use of clusters didn't start with Russia after it invaded. It started with Ukraine after Ukraine launched an offensive against its own population, a population that Jake Sullivan basically wants us to ignore because they're on the wrong side of the gun. They're people who don't want to live under a coup regime that Jake Sullivan helped install because, of course, he was a key figure in the Obama administration during the time of the Maidan coup in 2014. So that's the background that he's completely leaving out here.
And cluster munitions were not necessary. Did the Pentagon didn't deem them necessary, for example, in the campaign against ISIS in Raqqa, where it basically obliterated half of a city in Syria, mostly using like 500-pound bombs. It didn't deem them necessary at any point in the campaign in Iraq against ISIS. So why now? Why is this so necessary?
Well, Joe Biden answered the question when he was asked. He was asked this question.
I got it.
Said, okay, you got it. He was asked the question, and he gave, for once, an actual honest answer.
President, any update on the Mr. President, cluster munitions. Why now?
We've run out of ammunition.
He straight up said it.
Yeah. So in between being asked about the cocaine found in the White House recently, which is another controversy that has come up for the White House, and we don't know yet though if the cocaine baggie just is another Russian disinformation plot. So we have to await for former intelligence officials to weigh in on that. But yeah, that's Biden saying they've run out of ammunition. So we've been told this whole time that Russia's losing in Ukraine. We're winning. You know, Ukraine's kicking ass, and here Biden is saying, "Oh yeah, they've run out of ammunition." Ukraine has run out of ammunition. That's the reality of the war, a rare admission from Biden of what's going on. So rather than say, okay, look, they're in a state where they're losing so badly that they're running out of ammunition, let's maybe try diplomacy. The answer is let's bring in these internationally condemned cluster munitions that will kill people in Ukraine, not just now, but for generations to come. And I want to go back, you know, like the point about erasing the people of the Donbass and the conflict that's been going on for so long, and the fact that Ukraine's been using weapons against its own people for many years, the people who didn't want to live under a coup government that was trying to wipe out their ethnic Russian identity. This is, people probably have seen this before, but for those who haven't, this is September 2014. There's a time when outlets like CNN could acknowledge that Ukraine was attacking its own population. And this is one example of that from September 2014.
Petro Poroshenko will have a hard time winning back hearts and minds in this city. As the people of Donetsk sweep up the debris of their homes and livelihoods, they are hardened against a president they say is killing his own people. We are Ukrainian, but they kill us, this man says. So we probably need our own country, because these people in Kiev, they are not brothers for us. The shells hit these homes days ago, but the tears are still fresh.
27-го, 28-го, 29-го очень сильно. Фактично мы живем под подвалом.
Live on the ground. It was so hard for 2 weeks, especially for 27, 28, 29. But only today it's quiet.
Извините,
Sorry, I need to go.
2 people were killed outside this block of flats last Wednesday. One of them was a 50-year-old woman, the other a 34-year-old woman. Her husband, who won't talk to us, he says he's in shock, managed to make it down to the cellar with their little child, but she just didn't have the time. And this is a story that repeats itself over and over in dozens of apartment blocks, with civilians being killed by the constant shelling around Donetsk.
So that's
we're having a lag. We're having a lag there.
Okay. Well, for those who didn't catch it, that's CNN back in 2014 acknowledging the reality that there was an assault by Ukraine on its own population, and that assault was backed by the U.S. And not only can you not acknowledge the people of Donetsk now who are being shelled by their own government, you also can't acknowledge what was happening what CNN was acknowledging back then, because what happened back then helps explain what is happening now. And we saw accordingly, we just can't talk about it.
And here's Petro Poroshenko, the then Ukrainian president, boasting about what he was doing to not just people in Donbass, but to children, innocent people in Donetsk and Lugansk.
Тому що у нас робота буде, у них немає.
They will not.
У нас пенсії будуть, у них немає.
We will have pensions and they will not. We have care for our children. They will not.
Дітей буде, у них немає.
Our children will go to schools and kindergartens. Their kids will sit in bomb shelters and basements. They don't know how to do anything. This is how we will win the war.
Саме так ми виграємо цю війну.
So that's the leader of the democratic Ukraine boasting about Ukrainian children versus ethnic Russian children in the Donbass. Aaron, we've got some connection problems with you.
Oh, yeah? Okay. I will return.
So we've briefly lost Aaron. We'll fix this in post. So the cluster munitions that have been sent to Ukraine, Jake Sullivan said they're completely different than those that Russia has used or allegedly used all over Ukraine. And here's Alexei Reznikov, who is the defense minister of Ukraine, explaining precisely how those weapons are different. We welcome the decision of the U.S. to provide Ukraine with new liberation weapons that will help us to deoccupy our territories. under Article 51 of the UN Charter, we have a right to self-defense. So, and we've been requesting these munitions for a long time. So they've called cluster bombs liberation weapons, whereas Russia has occupation weapons. That's the real difference here. Isn't it obvious? Isn't it obvious that that is the difference? And Reznikov himself and his government have openly described their country as a laboratory for these kinds of weapons that are internationally banned. Alexei Reznikov told the Financial Times, our Western allies can actually see if their weapons work, how efficiently they work, and if they need to be upgraded. For the military industry of the world, you can't invent a better testing ground. He literally called Ukraine a testing ground. And so what he's doing there is appealing directly, not just to the Biden administration or Congress, but to the military industry, to the arms dealers. They can get their weapons. If they can get their weapons on the Ukrainian battlefield, then they can export them to other countries as battle tested at arms fairs. That's the appeal of Ukraine, according to the kind of characters that run the country. It's really inspiring. I can't think of anything to fight for worth fighting and dying for more than to be a literal lab rat for Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. And so those are the key. That's the rationale for sending cluster munitions to Ukraine. There aren't enough weapons. The U.S. is basically run out of howitzers. They can supposedly break the Russian trenches, which I don't actually believe. And if they're running out of howitzers, then what will be the delivery mechanism for the DPICMs? The U.S. hasn't yet authorized ATACMs, but these missile systems, which have a range of 150 kilometers, are designed to specifically hit inside Russia, which means that Ukraine is no longer following the spirit of Article 51, which permits a state to carry out self-defense for its territorial sovereignty. It's specifically violating it. So let's say they get ATACMs, they have DPICMs, so they start firing cluster munitions into Russia. That completely explodes their whole concept of self-defense, but it also will inevitably escalate the conflict. And what are they trying to do with their counteroffensive? As we pointed out last week, they're trying to hold Crimea hostage. They want to break through the Russian lines and get to close enough to the Black Sea where they can start firing at least HIMARS missiles into Crimea and hold hostage the peninsula. In other words, to terrorize the population of Crimea. If they have cluster munitions, we have to presume they'll use those as well in order to force Russia to come to the table and negotiate on terms favorable to Kiev. I don't think any of that's going to happen, but the logic there is one of state terror. And
yeah, I don't understand what possibly they could expect out of that tactic. Are they going to do better than what they were offered at the start of the war when they had a tentative agreement with Russia that Russia was going to withdraw to its pre-invasion lines? I really doubt that now. Russia's already laid claim to, 4 different areas of Ukrainian territory, might even take more. And are they thinking that if they can threaten Crimea, that Russia is going to give up on that? I personally doubt it. I think the best deal they could have gotten was what was on the table, what was agreed to before Boris Johnson came over and blocked it. An even better deal would have been before the invasion, which was no invasion, and all Ukraine has to do is basically accept the Minsk Accords, the deal that it had already signed. But as Andrei Yermak recently pointed out, Andrei Yermak's a top advisor to Zelensky. Some say he has even more power than Zelensky inside Ukraine. He recently said that a major obstacle to peace in Ukraine was Russia's insistence that Ukraine implement the Minsk Accords. So basically, in his view, an obstacle to peace is asking Ukraine to implement the peace agreement that it already signed. So are they going to do better than that by threatening Crimea? I really doubt it.
I doubt it as well. This really reflects desperation that these weapons would be delivered. And I don't have the tweet in front of me. You had Ro Khanna today complaining about the U.S. industrial base being shipped away and essentially outsourced. Why? Because we can't produce enough 155 millimeter howitzers. That's what he used to emphasize the importance of rebuilding the U.S. industrial base. The progressive star who stands in the shoes of and fills the hands of the mittens of Bernie Sanders. Pretty pathetic.
It's so funny seeing all these progressives now come out against the cluster munition transfer after bringing us to this point. The reason we're at a point where proxy warriors feel desperate enough to send cluster munitions is because they've sent everything else so far. And what they've sent, and when they sent everything else, that was funded by people like Ro Khanna and the Squad and every other Democrat in Congress. And now they complain that the clusters are a step too far. I mean, they've brought us to this point. So they can thank themselves for a policy that they now claim to oppose. By the way, here is Sky News admitting the obvious. U.S. cluster bomb deal is a clear signal that the war is not going well for Ukraine. That is correct. And this was entirely predictable and predicted, not just by us, but by the Pentagon, because we know from the Discord leaks, the Pentagon leaks, the Pentagon privately assessed that at best, Ukraine could expect modest gains from its counteroffensive. And of course, so far in the few weeks that the so-called counteroffensive has been underway, it hasn't even achieved modest gains. It's basically been losing very badly, with the exception of a couple of, I think, useless villages that don't have any significance. So no wonder they're doubling down with this desperate move that will only kill more people.
And it will kill people in the long term, as we've seen in Vietnam and elsewhere. So we will continue, unfortunately, having to follow the story of U.S. cluster munitions in Ukraine and their perfect dud rate, the liberation weapons. Do you want to? What do you want to cover now, Aaron? We got a lot of options.
Let's go now to this upcoming NATO summit where Ukraine once again will be denied membership to NATO, continuing this farce where basically we're supposed to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian, fuel this proxy war over Ukraine's theoretical right to join NATO, which in reality, the Biden administration doesn't even support, because the Biden administration has constantly used the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO to basically try to bait Russia into this war. And they've gotten what they wanted. Now Ukraine, being under a Russian invasion, again wants to join, but Biden is again saying no. And he just reiterated that speaking to Fareed Zakaria today.
Good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
When you go to the NATO summit, the big strategic issue is that Ukraine wants membership in NATO. Should it get membership in NATO?
I don't think it's ready for membership in NATO, but here's the deal. I spent, as you know, a great deal of time trying to hold NATO together because I believe Putin has had an overwhelming objective from the time he launched 185,000 troops in Ukraine. And that was to break NATO. He was confident, in my view, and many of the intelligence community, he was confident he could break NATO. So holding NATO together is really critical. I don't think there is unanimity.
You know, that's interesting. Biden's contradicting his own White House propaganda there, which is the White House line is that Putin went into Ukraine to take it over, right? To destroy Ukraine as a nation and to have regime change in Kiev. And that's the White House line. Now Biden's saying actually Putin's overall objective was to break NATO. So which is it? Was it to take over Ukraine or was it to break NATO? Because that's a lot different than what has been said by his administration so far. Because of course, you know, when you're doing war propaganda, it's hard to keep your story straight, especially if it's Joe Biden.
In NATO about whether or not to bring Ukraine into the NATO family now, at this moment, in the middle of a war. For example, if you did that, then, you know, I mean what I say, we're determined to commit every inch of territory that is NATO territory. It's a commitment that we've all made no matter what. If the war is going on, then we're all in the war. You know, we're at war with Russia, if that were the case. So I think we have to lay out a path for the rational path for for Ukraine to be able to qualify to get into NATO.
So think how cynical this is. All the U.S. had to do before the war was just say, yeah, we're not going to bring in Ukraine to NATO. And the U.S. refused to do that because Biden's argument was, well, it's an open door policy and anyone has the right to join, and we refuse to bend to Russian demands. So then you have a war over this theoretical right for Ukraine to join NATO. And then when Ukraine asks to join, you don't even let it join anyway. And he goes on to explain that actually, regardless, there's the issue of Ukraine being in a war, but also he says that Ukraine is simply just not ready. And he even cites the issue of democracy, which is funny because I thought he was in Ukraine to defend democracy. That's another one of his talking points. Which I will cue that up in a second.
Well, when he cites democracy, and this is also the same rationale that the same game that the EU plays. Von der Leyen, she said, we need to consider Ukrainian membership, but then every time after dangling it out before the Ukrainians, she withdraws it.
Yeah.
Her and Charles Michel and the crew pull it back because they say that they are not democratic enough. And the real reason is they don't want to give EU citizenship to a bunch of migrants.
Yeah, it would be a drain on NATO, and they only want Ukraine to be used again as a tool to weaken Russia. And if you admit Ukraine to NATO, then it takes that away. As long as there's the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO, that can be used to bait Russia into something like this, into this proxy war. And here's Biden basically throwing Ukraine under the bus some more and saying that it's actually not up to sufficient democratic standards, whatever that means for him.
NATO is a process that takes some time to meet all the qualifications, and from democratization to a whole range of other issues. So in the meantime, though, I've spoken with length about this. And one of the things I indicated is the United States would be ready to provide, while the process was going on, and it's going to take a while that process was going on, to provide security a la the security we provide for Israel, providing the weaponry, the needs, the capacity to defend themselves if there is an agreement, if there is a ceasefire, if there is a peace agreement. And so I think we can work it out, but I think it's premature to call for a vote, in now, because there's other qualifications that need to be met, including democratization and some of those issues.
So we're in Ukraine to defend democracy, supposedly, but Ukraine is not sufficiently democratic to be admitted to NATO yet. There's a contradiction there, of course, because the whole thing about democracy is just more propaganda. But look, Max, like you hear him say that the model he wants to follow is an Israeli-style model, which means basically a proxy state armed to the teeth in perpetual conflict with its neighbors, and basically an appendage of the U.S. military-industrial complex. What do you think of that vision for Ukraine?
Well, look at the situation with the Leopard tanks, the Challenger tanks. Ukraine is avoiding sending them directly into the teeth of Russian artillery now. The Western weapons that they've been promised would help them win this counteroffensive have not worked. The F-16s are not battle capable at this point either. The airfields have to be completely retrofitted and, if not completely changed, for the F-16s because they need much longer strips than those that fly Soviet era and Russian made planes like the Su-27. So you're talking about a long-term program of just dumping Western weapons into Ukraine and either soaking the Western public, the European and American public, to foot the bill for the arms makers, or those who are like shepherding those deals, the Tony Blinkens and the consultant class and the contractors, or you're having Ukraine pay directly. But either way, they're not making that much of a difference. Now, there are some weapon systems that have performed well on the battlefield for the Ukrainians. I'm not going to deny that. The Javelin, for example, HIMARS, they've used them effectively. But the Western armor, this flashy, expensive Western armor, it doesn't seem to have done anything. So there's that issue. I don't even think the U.S. had any delusions. Maybe some of the propagandists did the Ann Applebaums, but I don't think the Pentagon had these delusions. They're just seeing Ukraine as a long-term porcupine, the same way that Taiwan is, or Israel, what Alexander Haig called the unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Middle East. That's the function that it will play. Zelensky himself said Ukraine will be a big Israel, which necessarily means it's not going to be very democratic. So they will NATO-ize Ukraine without admitting it into NATO. Then but what the propagandists are pushing for ahead of Vilnius is straight up NATO admission. There is pressure on Biden to accede to Ukraine's request to join NATO. And that's coming from people like Gideon Rose, who I think is going to take over the Council on Foreign Relations from Richard Haass, the outgoing warmonger, who now said that the greatest enemy or the greatest threat to humanity is not from Russia or China, but actually from Americans who will not go along with the regime change wars, specifically Trump's base. And why would anyone want to allow Ukraine into NATO? Not just Turkey, but any of these countries. If Ukraine's allowed into NATO, you either follow Article 5 or NATO means nothing, because Ukraine is actively at war. There is a foreign army inside its borders that is fighting its military, and Article 5 would have to be triggered as soon as the request is acceded to. That means world war. I mean, it's never been more clear. You allow Ukraine into NATO now, world war is immediately triggered, or the NATO alliance means nothing and it fractures. And I think they understand that NATO would immediately start to fracture, because all these countries are not going to want to directly confront Russia in a military conflict. Maybe you could dupe the Polish government into doing that, but certainly Turkey's not going to go along with it. I highly doubt the Scandinavians and the Finns, who were inveigled into this alliance through their completely feckless outgoing Prime Minister, Sanna Marin. I doubt they're going to want to fight another war against the Russians. So there you have it. It's a gigantic shell. It's just a sham.
And Zelensky has played along with the sham from the start. He's been told, even before the war, that you're not going to join NATO, but we're just going to dangle that prospect publicly. He's been told that. He admitted it. This is him speaking not long after Russia's invasion. He admitted that he played along with this farce of offering Ukraine membership to NATO, which they knew they had no intention of fulfilling.
Yep.
Requested them personally to say directly that we are going to accept you into NATO.
Oh, it's lagging. I'll try that again.
To request for NATO in a year or 2 or 5, personally to say directly that we are going to accept you into NATO.
All right, well, that clip isn't working. But basically, in that clip, Zelensky admits that he asked, will you give me a firm commitment that Ukraine will join NATO? And he was told, no, but publicly, we're going to leave the door open. So you're not going to join NATO, but publicly, we're going to pretend as if you will. And he admitted that. And he played along with the farce because he's an actor, obviously. And he doesn't care about it, sacrificing his own country if it could benefit him and his small circle of advisors.
Yeah. And I mean, just to clarify about Article 5, while it tends to mean the use of armed force, and it did so after 9/11 when it committed all of these U.S. vassals to participating in the Afghanistan endless war, it can also mean, according to the language of Article 5, sending military equipment under the grounds of action that a country deems necessary. So that's what I think we're just going to see at Vilnius, is sending more equipment, enriching arms makers, and we'll see where Sweden goes there. But it's not it's not going to happen for Ukraine, and I don't understand how the population of Ukraine can continue to go along with this sham that their leadership seems to believe. I mean, and by the way, I had wanted to go to NATO to cover it. and I was following Michael Tracy's lead because he covered it last year. We interviewed him about it. His press credentials were denied without explanation. So they're not allowing any critical reporters in that we can think of. So I just figured, what was the point of even applying for credentials if he can't get in? I won't be able to get in. We've lost Aaron again, I think, because of internet connections. But as Ukraine attempts to lobby for NATO membership after being effectively NATOized, and Joseph Biden declares that Ukraine is simply not democratic enough. There's another campaign taking place, another lobbying campaign taking place inside the US. And it is to refurbish further the reputation of a neo-Nazi organization. This is Francis Fukuyama, who many of you will remember as one of the founding fathers of the neoconservative movement, original signer of the Project for a New American Century open letters, supporter of the war in Iraq, and the author of the sort of discredited book, The End of History. And history is repeating itself as he welcomes members of the Azov Battalion to Stanford University. This is actually the second trip of neo-Nazi Azov members to Stanford University. And they're being awarded. And here's Katerina Prokopenko, who I believe is the wife of the commander of the Azov Battalion, Denis Prokopenko, a famous philosopher. Francis Fukuyama joined us at Harvard. He expressed gratitude to Sergeant Arseny Fedosik for his service and heroism during the Mariupol campaign. So this is what's going on American campuses. And there's a quote by Denis Prokopenko on the projector screen in front of a class of Stanford students, along with the Wolf's Angle neo-Nazi. This is a straight up Nazi SS logo right there on the wall at Stanford University. This is the second time, as I said, Azov members have been to Stanford. Previously, they were met by Michael McFaul, the great analyst who predicted the Russian Civil War 2 weeks ago. And this is part of their rehabilitation in the U.S. It just continues on and on without any scandal. I think one of the few publications that actually called this out as disgusting was The Forward, because our friend Lev Golinkin, who is one of the foremost experts on Nazism in Ukraine, published an op-ed there. But the rest of the media is treating this as completely normal. And this is another sort of side effect of the Ukraine proxy war, is that we've once again welcomed Nazis into the U.S. as allies, as we did during Operation Paperclip and so many other CIA operations after the war, when one of the butchers of the biggest butchers of the Holocaust, Mykola Lebed, was brought by the CIA to New York to live in Yonkers and to work with other Nazi collaborators in publishing the chief Ukrainian nationalist publication Prologue right there on the Lower East Side of New York. This is not the end of history. History is repeating itself.
Speaking of Azov, let me show this clip. This is an interesting contrast. So Zelensky today paid tribute to victims of Ukrainian nationalists in the Second World War who massacred tens of thousands of Poles. Right after he welcomed home those Ukrainian nationalists' descendants, their followers from the Azov Battalion, who were recently freed from Turkey. They had gone to Turkey as part of a deal with Russia because they were captured by Russia during the war. So look at this contrast. It's in this clip from CBS News.
This morning, a tribute by President Volodymyr Zelensky and Polish President Andrzej Duda in Western Ukraine, marking the World War II massacre of tens of thousands of Poles at the hands of Ukrainian nationalists, now united in Zelensky marked day 500 of the invasion yesterday in a visit to Turkey to bring back home the commanders of Ukraine's Azov Brigade. having surrendered to the Russians after the siege of Mariupol. Under a deal, they were to remain in Turkey until the end of the war. Instead, a hero's welcome ceremony in Lviv and a vow to go right back to the fight. The specter of a major...
So you see that there's there's a contrast there. You're paying tribute to victims of Ukrainian nationalists, and then at the same time you're welcoming home their descendants in the Azov battalion who worship the people who massacred those Poles back in World War II. And now they're vowing to go back to the fight. And apparently, as the reporter there says, this is, Zelensky's basically breaking the deal because these prisoners were supposed to be freed at the end of the war, but the war's not over and now they're out anyway.
Yeah. And I mean, Denis Prokopenko, who was honored at Stanford University. I mean, this is a guy who, as Lev Golinkin writes, has been photographed with the Totenkopf, which is a skull and crossbones symbol used by the Nazi SS. He was featured on the cover of Azov's unofficial magazine, which uses the Sonnenrad neo-Nazi rune, favored by white terrorists, including the perpetrator of last year's massacre in Buffalo. And the flyer advertising the Azov event contained the wolf's angle, which is a hate symbol. I mean, it's defined by none other than the Anti-Defamation League as a hate symbol, and it was used in the Third Reich and today's Nazis. And of course, there's Andrei Beletsky, who founded the Azov Battalion, who said that their mission was to lead white Christians in a war against the Judeo-Bolshevik Untermenschen. So why don't they project that on the wall at Stanford? And I mean, and speaking of, whitewashing and rebranding, we keep getting told Azov is going to be rebranded. I don't know if this is the rebrand, but this is Munich's LGBTQ Pride Festival. Woo! So is that the Azov rebrand? I love, celebrating a Nazi collaborator at a gay pride festival, because the Nazis were so pro-gay. I mean, I know that some of them were considered to be repressed homosexuals, like Ernst Röhm, who were playing out their self-hatred against the, what they would call the sexual degenerates. But this is just a perfect spectacle of the sickness that has seeped into the West as a result of the proxy war, where one of the key figures involved in the Holocaust of bullets is celebrated at Pride, and people in the crowd are chanting for war. This is the base of support for this war, is among the progressive urban populations. And it really shows how things have flipped since the Iraq War, when it was like the heartland of the US and the right-wing Republican population. That was the base for the so-called war on terror. I don't know if there's anything you want to add. I know you have to go soon, Aaron, but I thought we could transition there to one more quick segment.
Let's do it.
Well, on that note, I mean, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is running in the Democratic primary, but he's being attacked as right-wing, partly because of his stance against the Ukraine proxy war, but also because of the kind words he's received from Donald Trump, from Tucker Carlson, from a lot of people who are considered right-wing. He's being framed by supporters of Joe Biden as kind of a Trojan horse for Steve Bannon. And RFK has said, I'm not going to denounce Donald Trump for supporting me because I'm trying to bring people together. And I think he reflects in the same way that, Biden or the House progressives reflect the inversion of the politics, the Bush era politics of the Iraq War, where progressives were out in the street protesting the war, and the viewers of Fox News were the main constituency for it. RFK is trying to bring back that kind of progressivism on most issues. I mean, on Palestine, his position is extreme. He interviewed you, Aaron, recently about the your expose of the Twitter file showing how the FBI, on behalf of the Ukrainian government, was demanding that Twitter censor you and hundreds of other users. And he published my speech before the UN Security Council, both on his Twitter account and on the RFK campaign's YouTube channel. So I don't know that that's right wing. I mean, this is just what I understand to be anti-war, but he's coming under harsh attack. And he recently had to defend himself in an interview with the New Yorker's David Remnick, who it was one of the nastiest, most smug interviews with RFK that I've listened to and heard. And, I'll play part of it right now. And there's so much to chew on in this interview, but this is I want to make sure I get the time signature right, but this is the section on Ukraine, in which, I think RFK gets the better of him here, but it's interesting to listen to Remnick's line of questioning. Well, it's going to take a second. We have to listen to some annoying ad. Hold on. I have a better. Well, all right. We'll just do that for a second.
Yeah, what I know is every major establishment rag is now attacking RFK Jr. And
same way.
That says to me that he is a actual threat to their agenda. Else, why would they be spending so much time going after him? Like the Atlantic magazine has published all these pieces. They published one calling him a MAGA Democrat. The Guardian, New York Times, the New Republic, obviously, all of the neoliberal outlets are going after him. And yes, I mean, on Palestine, his position sucks. It does. I mean, we've talked about that. It is right wing, I think. But of course, that position on Palestine is not where they're going after him. They actually agree with him on Palestine. It's the fact that he's also giving voice to an anti-war agenda on every other issue. That's what they're scared of, and hence the hostility from neocons.
Yeah, and I think that fear is distilled perfectly in this interview with the New Yorker Radio Hour, and the whole tone of it, where Remnick is really trying to. He can hardly contain his contempt, but he's trying. He's trying to sound measured, but you can just feel the resentment just dripping from every comment. And here's the section about Ukraine.
Is that we give a pledge not to put NATO into the Ukraine. And I don't believe there would have been a war.
I'm asking a different question. I'm asking
science on that.
Okay, here it is.
Why aren't they doing that? Well, one reason might be that for almost 20 years, NRA allies in Congress have blocked federal funding for research on gun violence. But that's just not Kennedy's way of thinking. That's a conspiracy that is just too out in the open, too political.
And he's calling a conspiracy theorist
Robert
again
Kennedy
and again.
Jr. voted for Joe Biden in 2020. And when I asked him why he decided to turn around and challenge him, he pointed first to the war in Ukraine. Like some on the far left and also on the right, he believes that the West...
The far left. You notice how he says the far left? Because, the left is for the war, I guess.
And NATO provoked Russia into the invasion in the first place. When I asked him what alternates...
That's a conspiracy theory, that NATO provoked Russia into the invasion. So I guess it's a conspiracy theory upheld by the current CIA director, William Burns, by Jack Matlock, former U.S. ambassador to Moscow, by George Kennan. I mean... Come on.
Sources of media he prefers. He immediately mentioned that he reads a blog by Douglas McGregor, a retired Army colonel who's sympathetic to the Russian government view of the invasion of Ukraine. Liz Cheney and others say that McGregor represents the Putin wing of the GOP.
So wait, he's quoting Dick Cheney's daughter as a legitimate source and then completely denying Doug McGregor's background as one of the most innovative generals in the deployment of cavalry in modern times in the U.S. military, who also was overseeing the Afghan withdrawal for Trump as a Pentagon advisor. And he just calls him some Colonel Crank who runs a blog. And RFK, he didn't say he reads his blog. He does live streams. He does interviews based on his military expertise with interviewers and posts it on YouTube. But anyway, so he's using Doug McGregor to paint him as crazy and Liz Cheney to paint him as crazy from a different angle.
Just one small correction. You said McGregor is known for deploying cavalry. I think you mean artillery, right? Because
he oversaw a lot of the strategy of using tanks against the Iraqi military.
But doesn't cavalry refer to horses? Maybe I don't know my military terminology so well. I don't know.
Let's just move on.
President Biden immediately put the U.S. at the center of a NATO policy of helping to arm and protect Ukraine. If you had been president a year ago, February, would you have done the same, or would you have let Putin act as he had hoped by arresting or killing Zelensky and installing a puppet regime? What would you have done as president if faced with an invasion of Ukraine?
I wouldn't be moving. I wouldn't be threatening. I would do what Putin had asked very reasonably, is that we give a pledge not to put NATO into the Ukraine. And I don't believe there would have been a war.
I'm asking a different question. I'm asking if you had been president a year ago, February, setting aside the long prelude to this conflict, if he had invaded, what would you have done?
I don't think if I was president, the invasion would have occurred, because I would have made the assurance that Putin was asking for. It was absolutely irresponsible not to make that assurance. Putin has a legitimate national security interest in keeping the NATO out of Ukraine, because he knows that we put Aegis missile systems in Romania and Poland as soon as we wrap them into the Ukraine. And he doesn't want missile systems 400 miles from Moscow any more than we would want missile systems 400 miles from Washington, D.C. And we would invade Canada or Cuba or Mexico if anybody tried to do that. He asked something that was eminently reasonable, that we would pledge not to put the NATO into the Ukraine. And, for generations, our diplomats have warned American leadership and warned the neocons who now run the White House that if we move NATO into the Ukraine, it would force the Russians to have a violent response.
Force them to have a violent response.
I'm not saying that Putin didn't have any options, but the Russian leadership, not just Putin, but the Russian leadership since 1992 were warning us, do not do that.
If you were president now, you would withdraw aid to Ukraine. You as American president would support the end of military funding for the defense of Ukraine to Zelensky.
I would end the war. I would negotiate a peace.
And what would that peace look like?
Well, you never know that until you negotiate.
I understand, but would you allow a peace that had much of eastern Ukraine and Crimea remain in Russian hands?
I don't know what I would negotiate. I know that the Russians had come to two different peace agreements, both of which were eminently reasonable. And so
what I'm asking is, what would be a reasonable peace?
Well, the answer to that question is strategic ambiguity.
Well, first of all, he's asking him to completely decontextualize the conflict and start at 2022.
Yeah, exactly.
And then negotiate from there. And he explicitly asks him to remove all history and then to explain exactly what the territorial compromise will look like. And in doing so, that's supposed to make him look crazy, as though there's going to be no territorial compromise.
Yeah. And also his initial question is based on a false premise. And this is the problem when in speaking to people like David Remnick, is they constantly start from a false basis, right? So Remnick said, okay, forget the past, right? What would you have done when Putin tried to invade Ukraine, overthrow Zelensky, and install a puppet regime? Where's the evidence that was Russia's goal? If that was Russia's goal, why did they go in with such a small force and not launch any airstrikes on the Ukrainian government in Kiev? That's what you do when you turn over to the government. That's what the U.S. did in Iraq, for example, shock and awe. So what Russia was actually trying to do is actually achieved the outcome that RFK Jr. is now advocating, a negotiated settlement. Russia was trying to send in just enough troops to basically compel Ukraine to do what it had refused to do before the invasion, which was negotiate a reasonable settlement to the issue of the Donbass war that had been raging for 8 years, and also get the U.S. now to come in and deal with NATO expansion and NATO military infrastructure threatening Russia. So Russia's aim, in fact, was to compel the very diplomacy that David Remnick thinks is so absurd. And so he's asking a question about that's based on that's not only asking him to Kennedy to ignore the past, but also is based on a false premise, because he's totally misrepresenting what Russia's goals were. And speaking of misrepresenting, let me apologize to you. I've been corrected in the chat. I thought that cavalry, like my understanding of military terminology is very antiquated, because I thought when you said cavalry, that referred to horseback, but apparently it's been updated to also refer to tanks. So I apologize to you for that.
Or mobile artillery, but I mean, whatever. I'm not a military expert, and neither is anyone at the New Yorker, apparently. I mean, it's so funny because Remnick positions himself as a kind of Russia expert, but he was always covering Russia throughout the 90s. He wrote a book about Khrushchev, liberalizing the Soviet Union. Then when Yeltsin comes in, he celebrated Yeltsin shelling the Russian parliament to get the hardliners out, who are the communists who'd actually been elected. And he said, you can't make an omelet if you don't break a few eggs. So that's, very democratic there. Celebrated Yeltsin throughout the 90s, then celebrated the Russiagate conspiracy. And that's what frustrated me about RFK and throughout this whole exchange is he never brought up Russiagate. And I've actually run out of New Yorker articles that I can show on my screen, but I don't know if you want. You can. I have one that Remnick co-authored, which shows It's actually not the Kremlin. It's St. Basil's Church zapping the White House from the sky and hitting it with Putin laser beams. This is a David Remnick article from like 2017 or 2018. Well, that's not even the Kremlin, and it's zapping the White House to control Donald Trump via Vladimir Putin. Like virtually every word in this article, including the I's, the commas, and the T's, the thes and the ifs have been completely discredited by now. And RFK didn't counter. You pushed one of the most dangerous conspiracy theories of our time.
Yeah,
I'm not the conspiracy theorist. You are.
Yeah, I know. That's the problem with dealing with people like David Remnick is they're given way too much credit and deference. They're treated as serious people, so they ask questions that are based on a false premise, and they're allowed to get away with it because they're not challenged enough on that. But yes, exactly. If RFK Jr., I think was fully prepared to be interviewed by someone like that, they point out that their facts are wrong, so they ask a question on a false basis, and they themselves are what they accuse others of being, which is deranged conspiracy theorists, because there's no more embarrassing and discredited conspiracy theory than the notion that Trump was a Russian asset and being blackmailed by Putin. Yet people like David Remnick and his colleagues in the New Yorker constantly push that. The New Yorker ran this puff piece on Christopher Steele by Jane Mayer, who has done the past serious journalism, but completely, I think, humiliated herself with this, about how Christopher Steele was this, just like this British spy who became concerned about troubling ties between Trump and Russia and wanted to warn the world of that. And he's been totally misrepresented. It was a joke. And they also,
as if he wasn't a mercenary who had been brought in by the Clinton campaign. She wrote extensively about his dogs and what a nice dog dad he is. But she was actually part of the original clique of journalists, including David Corn, who were distributed with copies of the Steele dossier early on during the Russiagate hoax.
There's another one. I think it was by her, somebody else in the New Yorker, that Russian trolls swung the election for Trump. So not just the email hacking, which I think has been falsely blamed on Russia, but even just these Russian trolls, these people in Russia and put up dumb names that nobody saw that swung the election. The New Yorker also pushed, was actually the original, or one of the original places that pushed the Alpha Bank conspiracy theory. This conspiracy theory that Trump and Russia were secretly communicating via the Alpha Bank server. That was written by I forgot his name, but another one of their staff writers. And that was also a complete joke. And they've retracted and apologized.
And it was Remnick presiding over this parade of discredited, bogus, conspiratorial Blumenthal quote unquote journalism. I think RFK and I don't know if he has a press team, but they should have made that interview a referendum on the elite press, the elite legacy press, and how discredited they are and why people hate them. So that was unfortunate there. David Remnick also himself in 2017, when Donald Trump was correctly, as we now know from the John Durham investigation, correctly pointing out that the FBI had been plotting against him. David Remnick wrote a piece. Again, I've run out of New Yorker articles somehow. You can display it if you want. And the headline was, "There is no deep state." I mean, it's like you have to, if you are part of something or you're a shill for it, you of course, and it's sinister, you of course want to deny its existence. So this is him painting Trump as a conspiracy theorist for acknowledging something that we all know to be true. And you know what Remnick's ultimately doing is he's upholding the illusion of party politics as democratic and as of the Democratic Party as an alternative. There is no deep state. The problem in Washington is not a conspiracy against the president. It's the president himself. And then, there's no real argument that there's no such thing as a deep state put forward in that piece. He just proclaims it, just as he's proclaiming, that the COVID vaccines were great and everything was fine. And there's no reason that people are attracted to RFK's message about them, because nothing bad happened there and we weren't lied to. Here's how the New Yorker promoted that interview, just the sheer dishonesty of it. They're quoting something that makes him seem crazy if you don't know the context of the quote. I don't necessarily believe all scientists because I can read science myself. Now, this, first of all, it speaks to a particular kind of sensibility of New Yorker reader who just simply loves and trusts credentials. They're credentialists. And anyone who has credentials, they believe, as if they're a religious authority, which is why they all trusted Fauci. So right there, RFK is evil. But what he's actually saying, if you read the article, is he's saying that he had read the science about the COVID-19 mRNA vaccine specifically and had determined, while the scientists like Fauci or the propagandists like Rochelle Walensky at the CDC and virtually everyone was saying that they would prevent transmission and infection, and therefore the mandates are needed, RFK was saying that was not going to be the case, and that the virus would continue to spread no matter how many people got vaccinated. And he was proven right. So if you actually read this interview, what he's saying is legitimate, but it's decontextualized here to make him seem like a conspiracy theorist, in the same way that there's no context, that Remnick specifically asks him to remove the context of the Ukraine proxy war, which is the Maidan coup, which is the war that's been fought since 2014, in order to tell us how he's going to negotiate the end. And that, to me, just is discrediting of the interviewer and their intellectual acumen, that we have to just narrow our minds and dumb ourselves down in order to accept their perspective over RFK's. It's not going to work, by the way. It's just not going to work. And you look at this tweet, it just got ratioed to hell.
It reminds me of something in the New York Times this past week, where I'm trying to find it, where basically they were using as an example, like they said something as an example of disinformation when in fact it was totally proven to be true. I don't know if you saw this.
I don't know. I was just reading the Washington Post, and there's this court ruling, I think it was in Missouri, that the state is forbidden from censoring social media, and they have a big headline about how that's going to harm the election because election denial will be allowed.
Oh yes, no, people are really upset about that ruling. So this is it from the New York Times. Like this case you're talking about, Max, it's being overseen by Judge Terry Doty, who was appointed by President Trump, and has previously expressed little skepticism about debunked claims from vaccine skeptics. In one previous case, Judge Dowdy accepted as fact the claim that COVID-19 vaccines do not prevent transmission of the disease. So they're saying that this claim that COVID vaccines do not prevent transmission, that's been debunked. When everyone knows now, I mean, even the New York Times in other articles admits that that's actually factual.
It's like there's something culturally wrong with the people who work at the New York Times. It's like they don't, whatever you thought about this in 2021, I think it's pretty well accepted that they don't prevent transmission and infection. But there are some people I've met who are still such COVIDians that they refuse to accept that. And they'll be like, well, it actually lowers the transmission rate by 60%. And in a large grouplet, that would justify the mandates because the people who have less risk of viral transmission are there inside the restaurant while the others aren't. And, if you're sitting down and eating food, you can't transmit it. But if you're up and walking, you got to put your mask. Like they still believe in putting their masks on.
Jimmy Dore, I think it's special, by the way. The lies are funny. It's about like how the transmission, sitting down eating only when you get up to walk across the front.
Yeah, that reminds me, in a week I'll be opening for Jimmy at Magooby's in Baltimore. It's a great club. I don't know if it's sold out or not, but July 14th and 15th, it's coming up fast. I luckily got to do some practice for my set at the United Nations. So with the British and Albanian delegations. So that'll be fun. But yeah, we'll be back on Friday. I'm getting a lot of comments and emails about people who think we're really tired. Are you tired? Are you fatigued?
I'm not really tired. No, I'm not.
You're not. Okay. We just look tired. I guess that's because we're old. We're aging, the aging process. I got to get my, my eyes done or something. But
you have a toddler, so in your case, you actually might be. I don't know how sleep deprived. I mean, you have a toddler and you run a news outlet, but I don't know. But I think, speaking for myself, I think we're fine, and we just, it's hard to, with the schedules we have, to do this consistently, but we do our best.
Yeah. Well, the hamster running on the wheel that's powering your router is definitely tired. So. But the point is, we do put in work every day, and so all the support that you can give us is critical. Just brought on Wyatt Reed, who's helping me a lot with editing, and we're trying to create a long-term position for him and for a few other contributors. I think I'll be starting a formal fundraiser soon, but all the support that, if you're watching this now, all the support you can give us is to reward the dedication of our contributors and just to keep the show going. So thanks for being here. Thanks for liking this stream and for subscribing. Also, you can sign up for our newsletter at thegrayzone.com. And we're still somehow on Pacifica Radio, WBAI in New York, and KPFK LA on Sundays and Tuesdays. Aaron, I don't know if there's anything you want to add before we go.
I'll have a new episode of Pushback very soon. I did an interview that I think people would like. Oh yeah.
It's been a while.
It's been a while.
Great. I won't ruin the surprise. I don't even know what it is, but I'm looking forward to that. Pushback is a classic. Someone says Wyatt needs to give up his Antifa affiliation. I think he quit Antifa a while ago. Basically, because he's not a Fed, he is not allowed in anymore. But thank you everyone for all the support. This is another large audience, and like the stream. We'll be back next week. Peace.
Peace, everybody.